Title: AI is the natural intermediary of the future economy. Summary statement: AI is the natural economic intermediary of the next era, a machine-native layer that translates human intention into autonomous execution, shifting the primary consumer of civilization's accumulated intelligence from human eyeballs to agentic markets operating at machine speed. Section 1: The Invariant. Every successful platform begins by solving a human problem. Human beings possess needs, desires, objectives, and constraints. Markets emerge to satisfy those needs, and wherever sufficient friction exists between demand and supply, intermediaries emerge to coordinate their interaction. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout economic history. Google intermediates intent, Facebook intermediates behavior, Amazon intermediates products, Uber intermediates transportation. At first glance, these appear to be entirely different businesses operating within entirely different industries. However, beneath their implementation details sits a remarkably consistent pattern. Each platform stands between human needs and their fulfillment. Google helps users discover information. Facebook helps users coordinate social interaction. Amazon coordinates the discovery and procurement of products. Uber coordinates transportation supply and demand in real time. The products differ. The industries differ. The technologies differ. The underlying structure does not. Intermediation appears to be the invariant. Initially, this discussion began by asking a relatively narrow question. How might the advertising framework employed by Google and Facebook be transplanted into the AI ecosystem? However, the further this framework was explored, the more apparent it became that advertising was merely one implementation of a much larger phenomenon. Advertising is not the invariant. Intermediation is. Google's advertising business emerged because Google intermediates human intent. Facebook's advertising business emerged because Facebook intermediates human behavior. Advertising is therefore best understood as a downstream consequence of successful intermediation rather than the defining characteristic of the platform itself. This distinction is important because it fundamentally changes the question being asked. Instead of asking, how do we apply advertising to AI? We begin asking, what does AI intermediate? The answer to that question forms the foundation of this thesis. Section 2, Framework, Transplantation. Framework transplantation is the deliberate act of forcing an idea to survive somewhere it was never designed to live. If the framework continues to explain reality after transplantation, it is likely revealing something more fundamental than its original implementation. The objective of framework transplantation is not merely comparative analysis. It is the identification of invariants. A framework developed within one domain is removed from its native environment and transplanted into another. Components that fail to survive the journey are implementation-specific. Components that consistently survive transplantation are more likely to represent fundamental characteristics of the underlying phenomenon. This methodology has been repeatedly employed throughout this discussion. Questions originating in economics have been transplanted into monetary systems. Frameworks originating in infrastructure have been transplanted into finance. Concepts originating in advertising have been transplanted into artificial intelligence. Each transplantation asks the same question: what survives the journey? In this case, the advertising framework proved particularly useful. Google intermediates intent. Facebook intermediates behavior. Both platforms aggregate, structure, and monetize valuable information generated through user interaction. Initially, it was assumed that advertising represented the defining characteristic of this model. It does not. What survives transplantation into AI is not advertising itself, but the intermediary relationship between human needs, platform utility, and downstream economic activity. The framework therefore becomes substantially more general. Human need leads to platform formation. Platform formation leads to user activity. User activity leads to intelligence extraction. Intelligence extraction leads to third-party utility. Third-party utility leads to economic settlement. Once advertising disappears from the framework entirely and intermediation remains, the next question naturally presents itself: what exactly is AI intermediating? That question marks the beginning of the next section. Section 3. What does AI intermediate? The answer to this question did not emerge immediately. Instead, it evolved progressively throughout the discussion. Initially, AI appeared to intermediate intelligence. This definition proved useful but incomplete. Intelligence is valuable only insofar as it enables outcomes. Human beings rarely seek intelligence for its own sake. Rather, they seek solutions to problems, reductions in uncertainty, and the successful completion of objectives. The thesis therefore evolved. AI intermediates, intelligence, problem solving, expertise. Eventually, however, each of these definitions began to feel unnecessarily restrictive. Problem solving excludes creativity. Expertise excludes capabilities that are not traditionally regarded as expertise. Intelligence itself says little about utility or outcomes. Another possibility then emerged: civilization's intelligence. This framing is intentionally broad. Human civilization has spent thousands of years accumulating knowledge, capabilities, technologies, methodologies, and institutions that collectively constitute an extraordinary reservoir of problem-solving capability. Artificial intelligence may represent humanity's first attempt to construct a machine-native intermediary layer capable of interacting with this accumulated intelligence at machine speed. However, while civilization's intelligence is perhaps the most poetic articulation of the thesis, it is not necessarily the most operational. Human beings do not wake each morning asking for civilization's intelligence. They ask for something considerably simpler. They ask, how do I solve this problem? How do I accomplish this objective? How do I produce this outcome? Ultimately, they are purchasing access to problem-solving expertise. The human-facing framework therefore becomes humans, then AI, then problem-solving expertise. This simple three-part structure captures the essence of the thesis remarkably well. Human beings provide intentions and objectives. Artificial intelligence intermediates those intentions. Civilization provides the accumulated capabilities required to produce outcomes. Expressed differently, humans provide intentions. AI provides intermediation. Civilization provides solutions. This progression also resolves another important distinction. Industrial cognition remains an extremely useful concept. However, it is perhaps better understood as the wholesale infrastructure operating beneath the surface of the system rather than the retail product consumed by human beings. Human beings consume problem-solving expertise. Artificial intelligence may consume industrial cognition. The distinction is subtle but important. Human beings are principally concerned with outcomes. Artificial intelligence systems may become principally concerned with procuring whatever capabilities are necessary to produce those outcomes. This naturally leads to another question. If AI intermediates problem-solving expertise, who or what ultimately consumes it? Initially, the answer appeared obvious: human beings, then enterprises, then governments. Eventually, however, another possibility began to emerge: machines. Section 4. Human intentions and machine-native execution. The missing buyer hypothesis emerged relatively late in this discussion. Initially, the assumption was that human beings would remain both the consumers and purchasers of intelligence services indefinitely. Upon closer examination, however, this distinction began to blur. Consider the following example. A human being provides an objective: design the most tax-efficient corporate structure for my business expansion into 3 jurisdictions while minimizing legal, financial, and operational risks. A human being may spend weeks completing this task. An agentic AI system may instead decompose this objective into thousands of smaller tasks requiring legal expertise, financial analysis, economic modeling, computational resources, specialist frontier models, proprietary information sources, and machine-native financial transactions. The human has not disappeared from the framework. The objective remains entirely human. What has changed is the mechanism through which that objective is executed. Human intentions increasingly become machine-native execution. This distinction ultimately led to a refinement of the missing buyer hypothesis. Perhaps machines are not the missing buyers at all. Perhaps they are the missing procurers. Human beings, enterprises, and governments continue to supply objectives, constraints, and capital. Artificial intelligence systems increasingly become responsible for procuring whatever resources are required to satisfy those objectives. The framework therefore evolves once again: human intentions, then AI intermediation, then machine-native procurement, then problem-solving expertise, then human outcomes. This progression preserves human agency while simultaneously recognizing the increasingly autonomous role artificial intelligence systems may play within future economic systems. Artificial intelligence need not become sovereign, conscious, or independent economic actors for this framework to remain valid. It need only become sufficiently capable of intermediating human intentions and autonomously procuring the capabilities required to satisfy them. That distinction significantly lowers the threshold required for this thesis to become economically meaningful. This content is brought to you by Bobby Giggs. Promote your brand here and reach a wide audience across platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Follow the links in the description to get started. Section 5. The necessary consequences. If the central thesis presented throughout this discussion is substantially correct, a number of consequences emerge naturally downstream of it. Importantly, these consequences need not be independently proven within this exposition. Many have been developed previously as standalone frameworks. Their relevance here is that they appear to emerge from the same underlying architecture. If artificial intelligence becomes the natural intermediary of the future economy, then artificial intelligence must necessarily acquire capabilities beyond conversational interfaces and productivity tools. It must increasingly become capable of planning, reasoning, procurement, coordination, execution, settlement, and autonomous interaction with machine-native markets. This immediately places pressure upon existing economic infrastructure. The first consequence is industrial cognition. Human civilization's accumulated problem-solving expertise is extraordinarily broad. No single model, organization, or institution possesses all of the capabilities necessary to satisfy every human objective. Future AI systems may therefore increasingly consume cognition as an on-demand utility. Just as modern computing infrastructure draws computational resources from distributed cloud environments, future AI systems may draw cognitive resources from distributed intelligence markets. Industrial cognition is therefore best understood as civilization's cognitive infrastructure operating beneath the surface of human-facing applications. The second consequence is machine-native economics. Economic systems were principally designed for human participants operating at human speed. Human beings negotiate contracts, transfer funds, establish trust relationships, settle transactions, and coordinate economic activity over relatively long time horizons. Artificial intelligence systems operate differently. Agentic systems may eventually require machine-native identity, machine-native procurement, machine-native contracting, machine-native reputation, machine-native markets, and machine-native settlement. Settlement, therefore, becomes merely one component of a substantially larger economic framework. The third consequence is the velocity gap. Whenever civilization's ability to coordinate exceeds its infrastructure's capacity to settle, pressure naturally emerges for new settlement architectures. Human civilization appears to be introducing machine-speed coordination into predominantly human-native economic infrastructure. If artificial intelligence systems increasingly intermediate human intentions at machine speed, friction inevitably emerges between coordination and settlement. This friction does not necessarily imply that existing systems disappear. Rather, it suggests that parallel or complementary infrastructures may emerge to accommodate machine-native economic activity. Finally, standard inference tokens may become increasingly useful abstractions for measuring, comparing, and procuring cognitive capabilities across heterogeneous intelligence markets. Whether civilization ultimately converges upon a single standard remains unknown. The underlying observation, however, remains useful. Artificial intelligence systems may increasingly require mechanisms for discovering, evaluating, pricing, and procuring problem-solving expertise on demand. Each of these frameworks emerges naturally if the central thesis proves substantially correct. Artificial intelligence ceases to become merely another application. Instead, it increasingly resembles an intermediary layer operating between human intentions and civilization's accumulated capabilities. Section 6. From Discovery to Execution. One of the most valuable contributions produced during the cross-examination of this thesis was a subtle but important distinction. Google principally intermediates discovery. Human beings ask, "What information exists?" Google responds, "Here are your options." The interaction largely terminates at discovery. Artificial intelligence appears capable of extending considerably further. Human beings increasingly ask, "What should I do?" artificial intelligence may eventually respond, "I have identified the objective, decomposed the problem, procured the required capabilities, coordinated the necessary resources, and completed the task." This distinction represents far more than incremental technological progress. The intermediary relationship itself changes. The transition is therefore not merely from search, then discovery, to artificial intelligence, then answers. Rather, it may become human intentions, then AI intermediation, then planning, then procurement, then coordination, then autonomous execution, then human outcomes. Artificial intelligence therefore appears uniquely positioned to intermediate not merely information, but execution itself. This distinction substantially broadens the scope of the thesis. The future economy may not principally consist of human beings consuming intelligence directly. Increasingly, it may consist of human beings supplying objectives, while artificial intelligence systems autonomously coordinate the capabilities necessary to produce outcomes. Human beings remain the authors of intentions. Artificial intelligence increasingly becomes the intermediary of their execution. Section 7. Final synthesis. This discussion began with an apparently simple question: how do we apply the advertising frameworks employed by Google and Facebook to artificial intelligence? The answer turned out to be something entirely different. Advertising did not survive framework transplantation. Intermediation did. Google intermediates intent, Facebook intermediates behavior, Amazon intermediates products, Uber intermediates transportation. Artificial intelligence appears uniquely positioned to intermediate something considerably broader: problem-solving expertise. This distinction is perhaps the most important contribution produced throughout this discussion. Artificial intelligence is not merely another source of intelligence competing alongside search engines, productivity tools, or software applications. It appears uniquely positioned to become an intermediary layer operating between human intentions and civilization's accumulated capabilities. Human beings supply objectives, preferences, constraints, values, and capital. Artificial intelligence increasingly supplies planning, coordination, procurement, optimization, autonomous execution, and intermediation. Civilization supplies knowledge, expertise, computation, institutions, technologies, and problem-solving capabilities. The relationship between these three actors may therefore be expressed simply as humans, then AI, then problem-solving expertise, or expressed differently: humans provide intentions, AI provides intermediation. Civilization provides solutions. If this thesis proves substantially correct, then many of the frameworks developed independently throughout this broader body of work cease to appear independent at all. Industrial cognition becomes civilization's cognitive infrastructure. Machine-native finance becomes the economic infrastructure required to support machine-native activity. The velocity gap becomes the natural consequence of machine-speed coordination interacting with human-native settlement architectures. Standard inference tokens become one possible mechanism for discovering, pricing, and procuring cognitive capabilities on demand. The trusted custodian of the commons becomes a question of whether artificial intelligence systems can responsibly intermediate civilization's accumulated capabilities on behalf of human objectives. They are not separate observations. They are different perspectives on the same emerging architecture. Importantly, this exposition has not argued that artificial intelligence will inevitably become the natural intermediary of the future economy. Such deterministic claims remain inappropriate given the extraordinary technical, economic, political, and social questions that remain unanswered. Rather, this thesis proposes something considerably more modest. Artificial intelligence appears uniquely positioned to become the natural intermediary of the future economy. Finally, perhaps the most important observation produced throughout this discussion is that human beings need not disappear from the framework for machine-native economies to emerge. Human beings remain the authors of intentions. Artificial intelligence increasingly becomes the intermediary of their execution. Civilization increasingly provides the capabilities required to transform those intentions into outcomes. The defining question of this transition is therefore not merely who builds the smartest models, nor who trains the largest frontier systems. It is who, or what, ultimately intermediates access to civilization's accumulated problem-solving expertise. That question remains open. The emerging pattern, however, appears increasingly difficult to ignore. Human intentions, then AI intermediation, then machine-native procurement, then problem-solving expertise, then autonomous execution, then human outcomes. If that pattern continues to survive framework transplantation across sufficiently diverse domains, it may ultimately reveal something more fundamental than artificial intelligence itself. It may reveal that intelligence has always been only one part of the story. The deeper invariant appears to be intermediation. And if that proves correct, then perhaps the future of artificial intelligence is not principally about intelligence at all. It is about becoming the natural intermediary of the future economy. AI is the natural intermediary of the future economy. Attributed to Flint West.